Hello, this is Rabbi Klein from the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. You know, a Hasidic rabbi was once interviewed on the news and they asked him, well, how many children do you have? And he said, one. And the interviewer said, well, what do you mean, one? I heard that you had over 10 children. He said, no, I only have one Leah. I only have one David. I only have one Moshe. I only have one Sarah. You see, each person counts in our community. Each person is unique. Beginning in the book of Bamidbar, of Numbers, there's a lot of counting going on. First of the Israelites last week, and now we talk about the Leviim, the Levites, and the Kohanim being counted. And the word here is to lift up the heads, Naso, lift up the heads. It's not merely about counting, but counting each family, lifting them up, recognizing each person has a role to play in the community. In the context of this week's Parsha, we are suddenly introduced to a strange individual in this community. I'm talking about, of course, the Nazirite, the Nazir. And I'd like to think about this person in the context of this week's Parashat. So first of all, let's look at the Nazir, or the Nazirite. Who is this man? He wants to distinguish himself for holiness. He says he wants to devote himself to God, Lazir Lashem. He takes a vow for a certain amount of time to devote himself to God. And there are certain restrictions he takes upon himself. First of all, Meyayin v'sheichar yazir. He cannot drink any wine or alcohol. He can't have a razor touch his head. Tag lo yavo al rosho. And finally, most importantly, he can't come into contact with any dead body, even one's parents, because the Torah says, nezer al rosho. There is a nezer, there is a crown on his head. The key to understanding the Nazir is to understand this term Nezer. The word Nezer means something that is consecrated or a crown. So if we put a crown on a king, they're consecrated for higher purposes. Who else wore the Nezer in the desert? Interestingly, the high priest. In Exodus, Bezalel the artisan fashions the gold diadem for the high priest. It's a golden crown, and it's called a Nazer. And what's written on this Nazer? It says, Kodesh Lashem, holy for God. In other words, the holy high priest is part of the architecture of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. He's like one of the vessels. He represents the institution of the temple. There are other prohibitions of the high priest, interestingly. They can't impurify themselves, even for parents. Unlike other Kohanim, where if a parent dies, they can impurify themselves to bury them, but not the high priest. They, like the Nazir, cannot drink any wine when doing service. And both of them have restrictions about hair. However, here they're opposite. The high priest, the Kohen Gadol, needs to cut his hair, the Torah tells us, but the Nazir cannot. What's the difference here? Well, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, has an official role in the tabernacle, symbolized by that diadem that nezer that sits on his head. It says, Kodesh Lashem, I am holy to God. And that is the message that he wants to project to the community, that he's serving the temple. And people shouldn't be fixated on his long hair. They have to be fixated on the message of the temple. Now, the Nazir himself does not have any external clothing to show the other people that he's dedicated himself to God. The only thing that he has is his hair. His hair, in fact, the long hair becomes the crown itself. People see this and they realize he's dedicated himself to God. So his outward appearance says, I have dedicated myself. So in essence, even with the hair, both of them indicate to the rest of the world that I'm dedicating myself to a higher purpose. With the high priest wearing the tzitz, the diadem which has the words holy for God, and through the Nazir actually having the long hair which he wraps around his head, where people say this person has dedicated themselves to God. So hence, who is a Nazir? A Nazir is somebody who chooses to take upon himself or herself a higher level of holiness, just like the high priest. You know the joke? the person comes to synagogue and says, I'd like to have an aliyah. I'd like to have the first aliyah, the Cohen aliyah. And the Rabbi says, you can't have the first aliyah. It's reserved for Cohens. And he pushes and pushes and pushes. And finally, the Rabbi says, I don't understand. Why is it so important that you get the Cohen aliyah, the first aliyah? He says, well, my father was a Cohen. My grandfather was a Cohen. My great-grandfather was a Cohen. Of course, the joke is that you can't become a Cohen unless you're a Cohen. But you can become a partial Cohen. That's what this week's Parsha is telling us. You can at least partly become a Cohen through imitating some of the same rituals that the Cohen does by taking the vow, the Nazirite vows. Given these positive aspects, it's very surprising then at the end of this section that the Torah commands him when he finishes his vow that he needs to go to the temple or the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert, and bring a sin offering. And there are many different explanations of why he would do this. I want to offer one that was offered many years ago by Rabbi Meir Goldvicht, Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University. What's the role of the high priest or the priesthood in general? And why do they even separate from the community at all with this higher holiness level? The motivation is clear. It says in the book of Leviticus, Kedoshim yu le'elokechem, v'lo yichalu shem Elohem, ki atishei Hashem lechem Elohim hem akrivim, v'yu kodesh. You shall be holy, God says to the priests, and you shall not desecrate the name of God, because you are offering the offerings of God. You are giving the sacrifices, and therefore you need to remain holy. So in essence, what the Torah is telling us is the Kohanim, the priests, are not just being holy for themselves. They have a role to play. And what's that role? They have to bring the sacrifices. And bringing the sacrifices of the people was a way to serve the people. It was an act of service not only to God, but for the people. Because according to the Jewish tradition, blessing came to the entire Jewish people through their effort, through the daily offerings that they gave on behalf of the people. So they have a specific role to play. Yes, they're holy, but they have a role to play vis-a-vis all of the people. Now, what about the Nazir? No fewer than 6 times does it say that he is doing this to separate himself for God. The Ibn Ezra says the following, the medieval commentator. Why does a person want to become a Nazir? Because he wants to distance himself from ta'ava. He wants to distance himself from temptation, and therefore takes this measure of what we would call temporary monasticism. He wants to separate from the people, to become like a holy priest, but he's very concerned about his spiritual welfare. Now, to be honest, it's very important to separate ourselves at times. For example, we have Shabbat every week. 6 days you should be involved, but the 7th day, pull back. Focus on holy matters. That's what Shabbat's about. So it's an important value. We need to make sure that we take care and we guard our spiritual life. It's a critical value because we can get immersed in the muck of day-to-day life. However, there's a danger here, and that danger is the person can forget the importance of community, the work of Naso to uplift every person in the community, every member. It's not just about you, it's about everyone. In other words, there's a danger that the Nazir would become focused only on his own or her own spiritual quest at the expense of others. And that's part of the role of a Jew, to lift up every person in the community, every member of the family. In other words, we need to be involved. The holiness and the purity of the Kohen, the priest, is instrumental in lifting others up. They prepare themselves in order to serve others. The holiness and the purity of the Nazir is really just for him or herself. Unlike the priests and the Levites, who are counted and lifted up at this beginning of this week's Parsha to serve others, and that's why they are taken out of the context of everyone else, the Nazir here is given no role. The Nazir may be instrumental in serving, but the Nazir is not commanded to serve anyone. For this reason, at the end of his vows, he brings a sin offering, a chatat, to make sure, To emulate a priest is good in terms of service and holiness, but you need to dedicate yourself towards holiness for the purpose also of serving others. Maybe that's why in this week's Parsha, right after the Parsha of the Nazir, right after the Parsha of the Nazarite, we hear about the priestly blessing, where God tells the priests every day, and in America we do it on Jewish holidays, but in Israel every day of the year, that the priests or the Kohanim have to bless the people. Yivarecha Hashem b'yishmerecha, may God bless you and protect you, and so on and so forth. This is the blessing that the Kohanim bring the people every day in the tabernacle and every day in the land of Israel. Why are these two sections of the Torah juxtaposed? Maybe the idea is to teach us that the holiness of the priests, the reason why God separated them from others, is not for themselves. It's for the purpose of being a blessing to all of the people. And on a larger level, the Jewish people are commanded to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So the idea of being chosen, in a sense, perhaps is the idea of chosen for service. We prepare ourselves to serve the entire world. Each of us in our lives, we have to think about the priest and the Nazir. We need to focus, like the Nazir, on our spiritual lives. They can be damaged so much in our world. It can bring us down. We need to focus on learning, on prayer, on carving out time to focus on ultimate matters. And I don't think many people often do this. We need to focus on this every day. We need to be like the Nazir in some ways. It's an admirable trait of what the Nazir is trying to do, to protect this holy soul and to elevate it. We need to have those Nazirite values in our life. However, we can't only focus on our own journeys. We need to focus on the journeys of every person to uplift everyone. We need to use our own spiritual capacity, our own talents, and our own unique abilities to lift up others, just like the priests did. The priests made themselves holy and preserved their holiness for the purpose of all of the Jewish people. So we should always remember the klal, the entirety, and we should always be sources of uplifting one another. Wishing all of you Shabbat Shalom.